For more than 25 years, Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army terrorized citizens in Uganda, killing tens of thousands, abducting more than 25,000 children to become soldiers and sex slaves, and displacing more than 2 million people. I recently spoke with Shannon Sedgwick Davis, an attorney, human rights advocate, and president and CEO of the Bridgeway Foundation, who, in the attempt to stop the violent armed group, stepped outside the traditional threshold of philanthropy. She's written her account in a book, To Stop a Warlord: My Story of Justice, Grace, and the Fight for Peace. Why decide to get involved in this specific fight? You're working with a charitable foundation. There are lots of problems you could tackle. Why this?
Yeah, so our foundation has a mission statement to stop genocide and mass atrocity on the globe, and we just found that we weren't doing that. We found that we were funding a lot of advocacy before mass atrocities or even during mass atrocities, trying to encourage other international bodies to get engaged, or we were putting Band-Aids on bullet holes in the aftermath. A rebel group would come burn down a school, and we would give grant funds to rebuild the school. And after the 2008 Christmas massacres committed by the LRA, in which over almost 800 people were killed over a series of time that they were actually there for their Christmas prayers, we really had to take a hard look at ourselves and our mission statement and ask if we were doing what we said we were going to do. And then in 2009, we heard rumor that there would be a subsequent Christmas massacre. Christmas came and went, and there wasn't. And then in 2010, in March, I traveled to the region and I learned from the Human Rights Watch researcher that we were working with that one had actually happened in 2009. So not only were over 300 people killed and hundreds kidnapped, but the world didn't find out about it till 3 months later. And that was it for us. We decided we had to either change our mission statement and do what our mission statement said, or we actually were going to have to stop doing this work. And that's when we decided to embark on this very unlikely alliance.
Now, you basically decided to help train an army to go find Joseph Kony. That's a pretty drastic step.
Yes, definitely drastic. And we looked at gaps in the mission. We spent a lot of time on the ground with the local heroes and community leaders who really did have the solutions at hand and really did know what it was going to take. And we kept hearing two things: that communications was a gap. This is an area where there was no cell phone coverage and often not even HF radio coverage. And so one community would be attacked by the LRA, and then the LRA would travel to a nearby community and attack that same community, and they wouldn't have warning of that. And so we were able to do some things and work with some local leaders, in particular a man named Father Abe Benoit, to actually bring HF radio systems to a lot of these communities so that they could give each other early warning. But another particular gap that you pointed to that we actually found along the way was this gap in training. The LRA was operating in these small, nimble groups in an area the size of California under triple canopy forest often. And there needed to be some training for the troops that were actually pursuing him, the African Union troops.
You know, it's hard for us to imagine in such a hyper-connected world, a place that really couldn't even communicate over high-frequency radio. The training raises a lot of sort of ethical dilemmas and questions. How did you get through that? I mean, this was a pretty precedent-setting, and were you concerned that this would open a floodgate of philanthropically funded armies?
Yes, absolutely challenging. And we had to spend a long time sitting and listening to what we were asked to come and bring, and solutions that others and experts that were much smarter than us thought that the area and the region needed. But what we couldn't sit with, it was very difficult to sit with the idea that we would actually intervene in this way. But what we knew we absolutely couldn't sit with was just hundreds of people continuing to be killed this way. The year before we intervened, there were 776 killed by the LRA. The year that we ended our strategic support alongside a multitude of amazing partners in an alliance we had, there were 12 killed. And last year, the LRA killed 8. That's still too many, but we could no longer sit with this.
You know, while I think that is sort of the larger success, is the decreasing the number of people who are actually harmed and killed by the LRA, someone's going to look at this and say, look, they spent all this time, they trained all these people, and that guy is still out there.
Yes, Joseph Kony does remain, and our work remains because of that. But I will tell you that this really didn't end up being about Joseph Kony. You know, Kony had a particular MO, and they would go into villages and they would kidnap young children, and then those children would ultimately become commanders in the army. For example, you might have someone operating in a certain region of the jungle that's maybe 30 now, but was kidnapped at the age of 10. And those folks did not want to be out there and did not want to be fighting for this cause. And when we stopped focusing on Kony in particular and started focusing on all those who wanted to come home, that's where we really saw success. I mean, we were able to identify in certain regions that there might be someone, Sam Opio, for instance, who might be hiding out in a particular area. And we could actually look back and say, could we find some of his family members? Do some of his family members remain alive? And could we maybe find them? And we had folks that would actually travel back to the region and identify family members for those still fighting in the LRA, and would record messages from those family members, from their mothers, from their sisters, from their aunt. Duag Pacho, come home, my son. I have never stopped waiting for you. And we would plug our cell phones, our iPhones into these speakers that we had on our helicopter and hover over these regions. And in the aftermath, 730 came out and are free now today.
You know, you talk a lot in the book. It's almost half the book is about a young man named David. He was once a child soldier. He was captured by the LRA. He managed to escape. Tell us a little bit about how he was able to use his story to help others.
David Ochidi is a tremendous individual. What a privilege my life has been that I've even gotten to know him. Yes, and David's story is woven throughout the book. David's story is not an unusual one. He was born the year that the LRA started. At the age of 16, the LRA came and attacked his village. They rounded up all the children and many of the adults. They took his brothers, and they asked him, who do you love the most, your mother or your father? And at gunpoint, David said, I can't answer that question. I love them both the same. And they forced him to answer who he loved the most. He said his father, and his father was killed there in front of him. And that's the way that the LRA operated, creating huge fear in the midst of these folks. And then they would go out and they would be abducted and forced as child soldiers into this particular battle. And what ended up happening was after about 6 months, David decided to try and escape. And he was successful at escaping. And he came out and tremendously said he wanted to give his life back to this cause. And so David is the one who does a lot of the family tracing that I mentioned earlier.
So what happened to his family? Does he know where his brothers are? Has he found them?
No. In fact, every time that we hear that there are some that have come out from the field, David hopes, of course, that he's going to see one of his brothers, but no, his brothers have not returned home. David's mother's still alive, and his grandmother is 104 years old, and he does get to see them.
Yeah. So tell me, in the kind of longer arc now, I mean, this has been, you've had a couple of years to think about this. If you had it to do all over again, would you do it the same way? What have you learned?
I would absolutely do it the same way, but make no mistake, there's not a one-size-fits-all in this mass atrocity space. In no way am I suggesting that this particular intervention is the way to go for all mass atrocities. But rather, I believe if you really spend time and learn from those who are facing these atrocities themselves and allow them to tell you their solutions, there's often gaps that philanthropy can play.
What kind of gaps do you think are almost universal when it comes to these different gaps? Like communication, for example, that's something that is a solvable issue in different parts of the world. So where should philanthropies be getting involved?
Absolutely. Communications is, I think, first and foremost, and that's something we've learned. And being creative with communications, there's lots of other conflicts we can learn from in terms of how they really attacked that particular element of a conflict. And encouraging others to come home. The Ugandan government in particular had decided to give amnesty to anyone who chose to surrender and come out, other than the 3 International Criminal Court indictees. And that was a huge advantage when that was able to be communicated to those who still remained in the LRA.
Is there a part of you that wonders about giving training to someone who might eventually use that training to harm someone else?
Absolutely, yes. And we did all that we could to try and prevent anything like that from happening. We made sure that there was human rights elements to that training. We kept a close eye and a close watch on that, but absolutely it's something that keeps you up at night and it's something you think about. In this case in particular, the other alternative was just not acceptable.
Is there enough being done, considering that your foundation, for example, is focused just on this, but in this space, are there a lot of other philanthropies trying to fill a gap where perhaps the UN and governments are not able to finish the task?
Yeah, there's simply not enough being done. I mean, you only have to turn on your TV or your radio for a few minutes to realize that the world is on fire and that there are so many conflicts just blazing on the globe. And we're just simply not doing enough. We're not responding. And my hope is that this book shows that there really doesn't have to be a fence around the human heart, that we actually can engage these issues, and that there are different ways that we can try to engage these issues, ways that are different than have ever been tried before.
All right, the book is called To Stop a Warlord, author Shannon Sedgwick Davis. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.